Plants are incredibly diverse, and I've made a number of videos in the lectures that I give to, say, general biology students on plants about, the diverse kinds of plants, their evolutionary history. The previous video was about flowers and pollination syndromes. And I'd like to just kind of follow up with other variations that we find in plants around us. So one is with seed dispersal. So here's a question. It's awful nice of these plants to make, in some cases, fruits. All right, so look at walnuts. Oh, that's very nice of them, because obviously that's giving food to rodents like chipmunks and squirrels. It's very nice to make berries because that's giving food to birds. Why are they doing that? Why are plants being so nice? And the answer is that plants have a very obvious problem when it comes to their offspring. Now, once again, if any of the students I have, or anyone listening is a parent, you might understand. If anyone's not a parent and a student, you might be insulted by this. So I apologize. So from a parent's point of view, some parents occasionally feel that you'd like your children to be successful. However, you'd like them to be successful at a distance from you, all right? And so, there are times where parents, want their children to be successful, but not necessarily in the same house. If you go out and you then, are successful, nearby, that's great. Well, look at this plant, for example. This plant is going to produce offspring in the form of the seeds, which have embryos, which can sprout into new plants. Now, this parent wants their children to be successful. They're going to give a lot of nutrients to make those, seeds, embryos with food in them. But that being said, if the offspring then grow up near the plant, near the parent plant, that's a problem, because now look, those offspring now need light, need water, need nutrients from the soil. And the only way for them to get it is to take light, water, nutrients that the parent was hoping to get for itself. So that parent would like its offspring to be successful, but would prefer that they were successful far away. And so how do you have offspring get far away from you if you're not mobile? Well, some can use the wind, as you see there, and there are different adaptations for the wind. You saw the very fluffy attachment to the seed that, on milkweed, but there are a number of trees where there's these thin attachments to seeds which the wind can then take and blow. But there is another option. The other option is to invite animals to eat your offspring. Now, I know that sounds odd, but if the offspring are then protected by a resistant coat around the seed, many of them will be then able to pass through the digestive tract of the bird, in this case, unharmed, and then be defecated far away. If that's the case, if a bird ate the seed, ate this fruit, because the fruit has sugars and other nutrients in it, but these seeds are protected, they pass through the digestive tract of the bird and then are defecated later, the seeds then spread and may even then, depending on the animal, for example, bears, when bears defecate, it would be a larger quantity. The seeds may actually then be surrounded by nutrients which will actually help them grow. And the parents would have succeeded in having their offspring be successful far from them. And so here we see that there are diverse strategies to spread seeds and to get them far away from the parent. Now, there's lots of sub-strategies, which, if you studied plants further, that would be of interest. So for example, in autumn, there may be fruits which birds eat first because they are very nutrient rich. So it was expensive for the plant to make, but then they are certainly to be eaten by migrating birds. And then there are other seeds which don't tend to get eaten first. The plant did not put as much free food into this fruit. But if the plants are there over winter, that during winter, the birds which stay in an area may now be, less picky, that the best fruits were eaten in fall, and now during winter they'll eat these other fruits. So when we look at the fruits that plants make, that is a way of inviting animals to come eat their offspring, which are protected by seeds, which will hopefully then pass through the digestive tract of the the bird, and then be defecated far away. So that is one way that non-mobile plants can spread their seeds. Obviously here with the wind, with milkweed, you can see that that is a second option. So you don't have to invest free food for animals, just in the membranes that the wind could carry. So here's a maple, which is going to take advantage of that as well. Here's Tree of Heaven, which also has these membranes that wind can disperse. And then there are other ways as well. So water can disperse certain seeds. Or some seeds then have little barbs which encourage their attachment, say, to the fur of mammals. And so if a mammal walks by, a tick trefoil, some of these seeds will stick in its fur. You may have had the experience where you go hiking in the woods, and then on your jeans, say, there are these then spines which then attach and then fall off later, farther from the parent plant. And so that is another way that seeds can disperse. Coconuts float. And so one of the strategies here is a palm tree living on an island then puts an awful lot of energy into a coconut. A coconut is a fruit. It's an embryo with a seed. It's an embryo with food encased around it, but an awful lot of food, with the idea that the embryo might have to float in the ocean for some time before landing on an island, and the island might not have much in the way of nutrients. So all of the nutrients of the coconut is what will get the embryo started in life. And so there are a number of different ways that seeds can be dispersed when we start comparing the plants in our area. Other examples that we see: some plants invest a great deal of energy into making thick stems, which allow them to grow upright, which lets them, get the sunlight first. Some plants are then parasites on these tall plants. They would like to get the sunlight at the top of the canopy, but they don't want to invest all of the energy in in a thick trunk. So then they will grow on top of the other plant. Now, a little of this wouldn't harm the larger plant, but the more successful this parasite is, now it's the second plant now covers the first, blocking its photosynthesis, and then at some point maybe even weighing down the branches to the point where the branches from the first tree might break. And so these ectoparasites growing on the surface of the other plants, they're actually parasites to some degree. There are different ways that plants can parasitize other plants. So there are some plants which don't do photosynthesis, like this one. Notice how white they are. Well, how can you be a plant and not do a photosynthesis? Well, this plant is tapping into the fungi which extend from the roots of neighboring plants and is absorbing water and nutrients and sugars from them. So it's tapping into the resources of neighboring plants. And some of these are very specific, only able to do that with, certain types of tree, for example. So that is another way of being parasitic. If you have fungi extending from the roots of another plant, which are fed by that plant's sugars, that you can then tap into those fungi and thus be parasites. Now, plants can also then digest animals. We see that with protists a lot, that there are some protists which can prey on other organisms, or they could do photosynthesis, or both. There's no reason that you have to pick just one or the other. And if you're a plant, there is an advantage of being able to kill animals. One is just you'll get nutrients that, energy that way. But also, some plants grow in nitrogen poor soils. And if you can't fix nitrogen or have a symbiosis with other animals that can fix nitrogen, you can, other organisms, you can eat animals which have nitrogen in them. So in this pitcher plant, the water which accumulates in these specialized leaves can trap an insect which dies and gets dissolved, and its nitrogen and other nutrients can then be absorbed. Obviously, Venus flytraps can actually trap trap insects. So this is a longer process to do that, where there are hairs in the plant which will prevent the insects from leaving that pitcher. Other parasitic plants include sundews, which make a sticky secretion which will cause insects to get stuck, and after they die, they can be dissolved. And so parasitic plants are supplementing their energy and their nitrogen by that they can get from animals like insects. As I kind of survey a few other variations which we can find in the plants in our area, I just want to, the first one here are thorns. Now, here, this is from Puerto Rico, the El Yunque, which is the only tropical rainforest, which is a national park. There were some thorns on ferns there. If you go to the Chaco of Paraguay, notice it's a thorn scrub forest where lots of small trees with very prominent thorns there. So thorns can obviously serve a protective function where animals are less likely to eat plants which have thorns on it. So, that makes perfect sense. A problem is, from an anatomical point of view, what is a thorn? Well, if we were to speak in anatomical terms, we would have to talk about where they originate, what tissues they include. Are they just epidermal? Do they include xylem and phloem? Where do they occur? At the base of branches, on the edges of leaves. And so if you were a botanist, you might now distinguish between thorns, spines, prickles, spinose teeth, and bristles. I'm not going to do that. I'm just saying that there are diverse structures, so that thorns did not evolve once in plants, and that all thorny plants then have the same type of structure, which we call thorns, but rather thorns have evolved multiple times, and so that there are anatomical differences between the thorns you find on one plant versus the thorns you find on other plants. One of the things that we can see from roots are very fine hairs which extend from the roots. And so if this is a root, notice all of the fine hairs extending from the epidermis of the root, which then will extend the area from which water and nutrients can be absorbed. And so the number of root hairs, the degree to which plants depend on that can vary going from plant to plant. All right, but that's another variation which we can see. Roots can vary a lot as we go from one plant to another, as is pointed out in this video. Clearly, there's differences between, say, monocots and dicots. So, where the vascular tissue is, that was pointed out in a different video. As was pointed out there, notice here where the vascular tissue is. This plant can form roots, but they won't be able to get much wider over time. But then there are plants which, instead of being annuals, are perennials. So notice here's the mature buttercup root, and notice where the vascular tissue is. It's still confined to this central area. But there are plants which will get bigger and bigger over time. And so the roots need a way to grow through secondary growth in the same way that a tree trunk can. And so, as we will see in just a second, the vascular tissue of a woody root can then have a lateral meristem, an area which can continue to produce xylem on one side to conduct water and phloem on the other side for sugar. And because of a meristem area, which will allow the plant to get thicker and thicker. So look here, this meristem area, it goes all the way around the root rather than being at the center. And so that as this plant gets older, it can continue to put more and more xylem on this side, more and more phloem on the other side. And that area of stem cells will then let it get wider and wider over time. And so some roots then vary in how long they plan on staying, and thus having the ability to grow wider over the time as the tree grows. There's also the possibility of lateral roots. So there can be the primary root, typically going down, but then there can be additional lateral roots, and lateral roots begin from an area known as the pericycle. So if we look here, here's the endodermis of the root, and the area just inside the endodermis is what's called the pericycle. It is from here that additional roots can go off to the side. So in addition to the original taproot going down, we can see here that there are lateral roots which can develop. Obviously, this can help for support and helping to anchor the plant, against, heavy winds and erosion, etc., but also then expand the area from which water and nutrients can be absorbed. Right? So there are lateral roots. Some plants, as mentioned before, develop symbiotic relationships with fungi and different kinds of fungi, both the mycorrhizae, which grow on the outside of the root but don't penetrate root cells, and then the mycorrhizae, or the arbuscular mycorrhizae, which actually grow within the cells of the plant root. So sometimes when you look at the root of a plant and you say, oh, these are plant cells, sometimes a third of what you're looking at by weight is actually fungi, which are in a symbiotic relationship with the plant. Another thing that plants can do with their roots is develop nodules for bacteria which fix nitrogen. So Many plants just absorb nitrogen from the soil in which they are living, but some plants then have nodules like legumes, like beans. And in these nodules, here they have specialized cells. So this is a plant cell, but inside the cells are bacteria. Bacteria live inside the plant cells. The plant cells feed them, but in return, these bacteria fix nitrogen. They convert it from nitrogen gas, which is not usable by living things for the most part, and they convert it into things like ammonia and nitrites and nitrates, which are usable. And so some roots then have specialized areas which encourage other organisms which fix nitrogen. And this then is an advantage because now this plant can grow in areas which are nitrogen poor in the soil where other plants wouldn't get enough nitrogen to survive. Once again, roots can do lots of things. So here there are roots which can help stabilize in sandy soil, hopefully, protecting against winds and, severe storms. So obviously a variation in the roots here. But a good example of that are what are called buttress roots. And a good example of buttress roots on the ceiba tree. This is in Puerto Rico, and very important in the Caribbean. The Carib Indians from the Caribbean had attached significance to these trees in a spiritual sense. But here you can see the great buttress roots here, which then stabilize the plant for support. Another type of specialized roots are those of mangroves. Mangroves then send out roots into water, and so they continue to kind of colonize the water, just like some aquatic things can colonize land. Here you see a terrestrial organism now colonizing the water. So you can see that roots are being sent out from the plant, which is established on land, further into the water, and thus the area of the terrestrial environment then spreads out now into the water. One of the problems is this soil, if your root is now underwater, doesn't get much air. And so there can be aerial roots as well that simply stick up to absorb oxygen and carbon dioxide from the air because in stagnant water, in mud, those plants would not have, say, the oxygen they need to metabolize the sugars which they had produced. So there are lots of different types of roots that one can have. For the plants which are parasites living on other plants, say up in the air, they can form aerial roots. These plants obviously never reach the soil, and so they can develop these adventitious, these aerial roots, which will absorb, say, rainwater from the plant on which they are living. And here you can see such as orchids and a number of other plants are growing on trees, and as such their roots are going to attach them to the tree and also then try to absorb water from rainfall, because those roots will never then reach the ground. There can be then there are parasites which we can see in the Northeast United States as well, such as poison ivy. You can see this growing up this tree. So while some roots can then be in the ground absorbing water, then you can also then send out roots from the stem, known as adventitious roots. So in addition to the roots which are part of the root system, you can then also have these adventitious roots coming from the stem, which will help the plant anchor itself to the trunk of the tree, allowing the vine to grow up. So when we look here, those are the leaves of the tree, but these are the leaves of the poison ivy growing on the tree, and the adventitious roots, which help it to attach, then allow it to be an epiphyte, a plant which grows on the surface of another. Plant, there are a number of plants which can do this, a number of brambles, and then also wisteria is an invasive plant. It has beautiful flowers, but you can see that some of these plants with their creeping stems and their ability to attach to other larger things like trees allow them to form then vines which grow up the tree. So there you can see this vine. And sometimes the mass of all of this becomes so great that it obscures the photosynthesis that the original tree can get, or might even provide so much weight that it then breaks branches or may cause the entire tree to collapse. So these epiphytes can be serious parasites on the outside of the plants here, and you can see how thick these vines are growing. Once again, just returning to the theme of how do plants vary. If you were to say go out into the field and study these flowers. Some, for example, flowers don't have regular parts, so like regular petals which form, a pattern of 3 or whatever. So for example, orchids, including some of the wild orchids which occur in our area, like pink lady slipper. These would be examples of flowers which have an irregular structure. But then there are flowers which have regular parts. So they might have, say, 2 petals, or 3 petals, or 4 petals, or 5 petals, etc. And sometimes if you were going to identify them, the number of petals would be important. Getting back to the pollinators mentioned in the previous video, the structure of the flower also then tends to encourage only specific pollinators. So a hummingbird is likely to pollinate this flower. And you can see because it has tubular flowers that can be accessed if you were hovering next to the flower. And when you look at the position of the sex organs of the flower, you can see that these stamens are positioned where they could deposit pollen on a hovering hummingbird. And this female carpel, so here's the stigma where the pollen grains need to be deposited so they can grow through the style to reach the ovary. So that flower structure is reflected by the pollinator that the plant hopes to attract. And so there are different structures of flowers. Some are very open. If they are less, picky, some are closed flowers. Flowers can have different numbers of repeating parts. And once again, if you were keying flowers out and trying to identify them, many keys would then ask, are there 2 regular parts, 4 regular parts, etc. So here, for example, we're getting to, here are flowers that can have 3 regular parts. There are a number here, 4, 5, 6, many, etc., such as daisies. So here are some which have 4. And so flowers can vary in structure. Here you can see a variety of sizes, a variety of colors, a variety of structures, which would determine which pollinators can access the flowers, etc. So starting to get to more and more petals. So this is one of the ways that flowers can vary. Another way that flowers can vary is by the season in which they bloom, right? And so if you were to study flowers in our area, there would be some which bloom in early spring, some in late spring, some in early summer, some in late summer, some in autumn, etc. Now, one of the things that flowers are trying to do is obviously, one, they need pollinators to have food throughout all of the seasons, because if bees have no food in midsummer, then obviously they would die, so that no plants could be pollinated in late summer. But also, it's up to a flower's advantage to bloom when it doesn't have as much competition. Otherwise, its pollinators might go from this species to a different species. And so these flowers, there are advantages to blooming at then different times of the year. So that's something that can cause plants to vary. Now, before I get to the additional things, here's just a bit more on mangroves and their roots. So you can see, once again, here they are extending further and further into the water, and thus land can expand. And there are mangroves are extremely important in coastal environments, and then for fish as well, because their roots provide wonderful places. Here are mangrove roots from underwater, wonderful places for fish to mature when as juveniles, where they're protected before they're large enough to swim out into the open ocean. Before I get to the plant keys, just one more topic is that of invasive species. So in a way, this is hard to talk about because the story of evolution is really the story of success, because there are lots of species no longer with us. They have become extinct. The species which we see outside our windows are the success stories, which have adapted to the environments which we have today. Unfortunately, in the modern world, humans are so mobile. We are capable of, whether purposely or by accident, bringing a plant or an animal from one part of the world to another, where it doesn't have predators, where it can spread. And so thus it's not a native species, it's rather an invasive species like the purple loosestrife given here. The problem is that these invasive species, they can take over. And then this makes it harder for the native plants to thrive. And so very often as an invasive spreads, it spreads at the expense of the natives, which then become more and more rare. Also, plants can change the habitat. So an invasive species can now, become taller stems and root systems, which will then, make it harder, say, for ducks to inhabit the wetland where they had lived, or turtles. And so one of the threats facing the endangered bog turtle is that this purple loosestrife, which is an invasive species, is spreading and changing then the wetland habitat where those bog turtles had formerly existed. Purple loosestrife is an invasive species in our area. It is not native, and it is changing the habitat to the detriment of the native species. Another invasive species is Japanese knotweed, which, as you can see as from these images, many have taken along the Delaware River, that it has simply taken over. Now, once again, there used to be other plants here, native plants, but because of how successful this Japanese knotweed has been, those other plants have been crowded out. And so, things like cardinal flower would have been more abundant here, but obviously in this, shade, this is affecting plants, and then even the animals in this area now have an altered habitat. And so while in a sense, species are constantly migrating to new areas, and that's just part of evolutionary history. These are not natural migrations. It was humans who, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, moved these plants here. And so the question is, what do we do? And most individuals who are ecologists try to limit the spread of invasive species to help the native species. One final topic, and here I'm going to go to my website. Now, this website will need to be updated in a little bit, so it may not forever look exactly like this. But on my website at bio.suny-orange.edu, if you were to go to wildlife of the Northeast United States. One of the links is plants, including plant keys. And there are botanists at the college. Monty Vassara helped with the plant key for the flowering plants, which are not trees. The one that I ask my students to visit are the ones I had done with ferns, club mosses, and trees. Although this one, which Professor Vassar uses in his botany class, is wonderful as well, and I encourage you to use that as well. Let me just kind of start off with the simplest ones. So if you find a horsetail and you would like to identify what species of horsetail it is, well, that's easy because in our area we only have two. The rough horsetail is a tall olive stem with no branches, but the field horsetail has whorled branches from the main stem, giving it a bushy appearance. So from this little key here, you could then go and then just read on the rough horsetail, which occurs in our area, or the field horsetail. Okay. Club mosses are primitive vascular plants, and if you wanted to study the club mosses in our area, there are three. So then you would have to determine which of these three it was. So is it the staghorn club moss, the tree club moss, or the running pine here? If you wanted to identify ferns, now we start to get into a bit more trouble because there are so many. And so what you would want is a key where you're asking, maybe one or maybe a couple of questions. So first question is, does the fern have a naked leaf axis with all leaflets being at the top of the leaf, primarily in a horizontal plane? So in other words, is a fern growing straight, like having like a little trunk, and then the leaves are all kind of growing in a flat plane there? If you said, yes, that's the fern that I'm looking at and I'm trying to identify, well, good. Now go here, and then you have to ask, which of these is true? Is it a tall fern with triangular leaves or much smaller with a thin black stem? And so you say, oh, I was looking at bracken fern. Or, oh, I was looking at maidenhair fern. Now, going back to this, if that wasn't your original description of the fern, if you said, oh, well, this is a large fern more than 3 feet tall, then you would go here. Now you'd have to distinguish between which of the large ferns in our area it was. Royal fern, interrupted fern with its spores in the middle of the leaf, cinnamon fern, or ostrich fern. If it was a small fern whose leaflets are entire, all right, that means they're not toothed, then you would click there, and they'll have to distinguish between these three. If it was a medium-sized fern, that's a little trickier because there are so many different kinds. And so you could go here for the wood ferns, if there are brown scales along it, or if it was lacy leaves with more than 20 leaflets, then have to go here. So if you wanted to identify ferns, notice that it's a little trickier, just because there's more, and you would then have to use a key. You answer a question, and your answer to the question then branches you out to a subset of trees, so you're not having to look at all of them at one time. Finally, here with trees, if you wanted to identify a given tree, and as a biologist, you might want to identify trees, or even if you were interested in like the ecology of the area or the birds, even if trees aren't your primary focus, nevertheless, what tree is this bird eating leaves from? Or eating fruits from? That might be important for your study on birds, for example. So in the key that I made this is for the Northeast United States, primarily, the New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. So the first question is it an evergreen tree with needles? So you would want to answer that. And if the answer is yes, go here. So you wouldn't be looking at oaks and maples, etc. You would just be looking here. And then you would then ask the question, are the needles joined to each other in bundles around the twigs? If you answered yes, then you're looking at a pine or a larch. And then go here and ask, are there 5 needles in a bundle, 3 needles in a bundle, etc. Are the needles single and actually joined to the twigs, but not in a bundle? Right, and then if you answer yes, then you go here and you're going to distinguish between, say, hemlocks and yews and firs and spruces. If the leaves are flat or scale-like, you go here to distinguish between cedars and junipers. So once again, by answering one question, it then takes you to a subset of the original trees. Some trees have what are called compound leaves. Now I know this is a difficult concept, and to a certain degree you just have to to practice. But if you were to ask how many leaves this was, if you counted, you say, oh, there's 7 leaves there. The answer is no, it's just 1 leaf. Now some leaves have lobes, like they have these invaginations, but in some leaves they are so deep, the invaginations, that it actually looks like separate leaves. And if you look for the bud, you don't really even see a bud until here. There are no buds at the bases here. There's just a bud there. And so where it's swollen to join the twig. And so and once again, unfortunately, to some level, you just have to kind of familiarize yourself with the ones in this area. But these are compound leaves. So this is just one single leaf of these locusts. Or here you can see, of this hickory or that hickory, there are 1 single leaves, and you might count the leaflets. Sometimes, you can have, 20 or more leaflets making up a leaf. And so there are things like walnuts and butternuts and the tree of heaven, etc. And so that's another subset of trees, those trees which have compound leaves that you would want to look there. Now, sometimes the compound leaves are what are called opposite. So if, say, this is the branch, that one compound leaf goes this way, and then one compound leaf goes in exactly the opposite direction, whereas other times they would be alternate. One comes out here and one comes out here. So once again, if you're trying to identify trees, instead of getting a tree guide and going through each page, you would like to, subdivide. So if you don't have an evergreen tree and you don't have compound leaves, then you have simple leaves, they're not compound. And then the next question to ask is, are they opposite? So once again, do they come out in this direction? And if they do, now you're looking at things like maples or viburnums. Whereas if you look at maples, when you see one leaf go out this way, there would be another leaf going out in the opposite direction there. So if you could look at a maple, I'll look for a better example. But maples are opposite, so that this one here is going in the opposite direction as this one. And above that, there's one going this way and one going this way. So if you found opposite leaves, you would go to this part of the key. Otherwise, you have simple alternate leaves. And so you have, one leaf going out this way and now one leaf going that way. And there's a large number of these, including the oaks, which have a number of species. And so one of the aspects to studying plants at some point is to identify specifically which one you're looking at. And so you can make yourself you can take advantage of keys which ask you to answer a question, and instead now of looking at all of the flowers or the ferns or the trees in one area, you're now directed to a subset of them. So this was just kind of a quick overview of some of the variations in the plants which we can find in our area.